Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and today we're continuing the founding of Jin Let's Talk Lore series with episode 3, titled Jin Policy Reforms. Before we get started, here's the answer to our trivia question from the end of our last episode, and be sure to stay tuned until the end of this episode for a brand new trivia question. Now, with any new dynasty comes new policies and new reforms, and the Jin dynasty would be no different, as even before the abdication, Sima Zhao pushed for a major reform of the nobility system in 264. Written by official Pei Xiu, the five-tier nobility system was reformed to allow for non-imperial clan members to receive higher-tier titles. For those unfamiliar with the Chinese five-tier nobility system that was originally created as part of the Zhou rites during the Zhou dynasty, the five tiers are Gong, Hou, Bo, Zi, and Nan. Localized to match Western nobility titles, Gong is often translated as Duke, Hou is Marquis, Bo is Earl, Zi is Viscount, and Nan is Baron. But aside from being easier to relate and remember, the benefits of each title do not remotely match up with the Western counterpart, so for the purpose of our series here, I will be using the Chinese terms going forward instead of the Western localization to reduce confusion in meaning. By changing the 20-tier Wei nobility system to the more classic 5-tier system of the Zhou dynasty, the main goal was to actually provide promotions for the Gentry clans. While this might sound counterintuitive as you're going from 20 tiers to 5 tiers, you have to understand two things. First, while the Wei system had many more tiers, it also had strict rules on how high one's nobility title can go. So most of the higher tier titles were strictly reserved for members of the Imperial clan only, as most Gentry clans found themselves stuck in crowded lower tiers with little social mobility. Second, the 5-tier system used by the Jin dynasty had sub-tiers, as each of the Gong, Hou, Bo, Zi, Nan were split into two sub-tiers based on the size of the title land. Take Gong for example. If your given title land was a commandery, then you are a commandery tier Gong, as in the case of General Shi Bao, who will eventually get the title of Leling Gong, or the Gong of the Leling commandery. But if your title land was just the size of a county, as in the case of Wang Xiang, who would eventually become Suilin Gong, where Suilin, his title land, was just a 75 li stretch of land, or the size of a county. Now, both of these titles were Gong tiered, but the commandery level 1 allows Shi Bao to get over 3,000 households worth of tax incomes per year as his annual stipend, and more importantly, in the Jin dynasty, it also allowed him to have his own private retinue army of up to 1,100 troops. Meanwhile, the county tier Gong title that Wang Xiang held only grants him 1,800 households worth of tax income per year as a stipend, and he had no rights to a private army. And similar differences existed for all 5 tiers. What is the most important takeaway here is that the high-tier titles like Gong were not previously available to non-imperial clan members in the Wei dynasty, and none of the nobilities were trusted to have their own private armies, as the founding emperor Cao Pi made strict rules to suppress the power of all nobilities, including members of his own clan. Trying to do the opposite, Sima Yan and the Jin dynasty overcorrected this mistake, as the Sima clan saw their own rise as a direct testament to the result of the weakened nobility system. Thus, aside from reforming the 5-tier nobility system, the prince tier titles reserved for imperial clan relatives were also reworked in the early days of the Jin dynasty. 4 tiers of prince titles were created that range from county-size princedoms on the low end to multiple commandery-size large princedoms on the high end. Not only were the tax stipends extremely generous, ranging from 3,000 to 20,000 households worth of tax income, all princedom were allowed to have their own private armies. Large princedom were allowed to have up to 5,000 troops, which was a substantial amount, and this level of militarization of the princes in the Jin dynasty is exactly what led to the subsequent Eight Princes conflict. Furthermore, Dujun, or the surveillance army division, that was used both in the Han dynasty and the Wei dynasty to act as supervision surveillance units over the princedom, was entirely abolished by Sima Yan. The Twin Tian farm system and the troop hostage system used by the Wei dynasty, where troops on deployment had to have family members back in Wei to serve as leverage over their loyalty, was also abolished. While the new policies were much more humane, as Sima Yan was hoping to wind down the wartime policies of the Wei dynasty in anticipation of a more united and peaceful country moving forward, all these reforms would have unintended consequences in the future. Now, aside from improving the quality of the prince nobility titles, the quantity was also vastly increased as soon after Sima Yan's ascension to the throne as the first emperor of Jin. 27 imperial relatives would be named as princes. This number would jump to 57 near the end of Sima Yan's reign. And over the course of the entire Jin dynasty, just the annual stipends for the nobilities would end up taking anywhere from 1/10 to 1/3 of the annual tax revenues. In addition to reforms to the nobility title, court structure was also reformed to accommodate the gentry clans. The creation of a third department called 门下省, literally translating as the agency under the gates, completed the three-department structure of bureaucracy that would become the mainstay of Chinese imperial courts until the Song dynasty. And joining the Department of State Affairs, or 尚书省, and the Imperial Secretariat, or the 中书省, 门下省 would further weaken imperial power as it gave imperial attendants veto power over imperial edicts. Now, while this might sound surprising to many, up until the Yuan dynasty, the power of the emperor was never absolute in Chinese politics, as there was a significant balance of power from the imperial court. Naturally, this arrangement benefited the gentry clan, or the ruling elites, that had a monopoly over the imperial court through the abuse of the Wei 9-tier recommendation system. Originally a mechanism proposed by Chen Qun under Cao Pi's command to reform and improve the original Han recommendation system for political posts, the 9-tier recommendation system failed in practice, as gentry clans soon monopolized the regional rating agencies used to judge candidates for the 9-tier system. The end result was the exclusion of non-gentry clan talents from the top 3 tiers, and a meritless system that strictly favored the most influential and powerful gentry clans. Official Du Yu, the grandson of the Wei administrator Du Ji, tried to propose a 6-year review cycle in order to weed out some unfit officials who unfairly benefited from the current 9-tier system, but in order to stabilize his new dynasty and appease the gentry clans, Sima Yan turned down Du Yu's proposal, as it would take until the Sui dynasty 300 years later for China to implement its first form of merit-based imperial examination system for the selection of court officials. Well, it would seem that the Jin dynasty had to compromise a lot of its early policies to favor the gentry clan in order to solidify the legitimacy of the Sima clan. There were plenty of good reforms and policy implementations in these early years as well. For example, remonstrance officials, or officials whose job was to review the emperor's actions and decisions and reprimand the emperor for mistakes, were once again allowed, as the Wei dynasty had banned this practice. Sima Yan was also very lenient when it came to allowing former officials from rival kingdoms and relatives of political enemies to earn court positions in the Jin court. For example, official Xu Qi, whose father Xu Yun took part in the coup against Sima Shi, was allowed to become the Minister of Ceremonies, even though his father was convicted of treason before dying in exile. Zhuge Liang's grandson, Zhuge Jing, was not only allowed to hold a position, but eventually even allowed to leave the capital to become a regional official as the prefect of the Jiang province. Now, as Sima Yan will pick the name Qin Shi, or the beginning of Qin, for his calendar name, in a reference to the Qin dynasty of the past, in hopes of reunification, the first written code of law for the Jin dynasty will also be referred to as the Qin Shi Code. And for those who are unfamiliar with Chinese calendar system, it goes without saying that ancient China did not use the modern calendar that sets the birth of Christ as year 1. Instead, emperors picked 2 character names for calendars during their reign. And for example here, the first year of Sima Yan's reign in 265 would be referred to as the first year of Qin Shi, and then you would have your second year and so on until the emperor decides to change the name, or until the death of the current emperor, which is when a new emperor will pick a different calendar name to keep track of the years. Now, the Qin Shi Code was a revolutionary code of law in Chinese history for its conciseness and clarity. Written mainly by Jia Chong with the helps of Yang Hu and Du Yu, the Qin Shi Code had a total of 20 chapters that covered the list of crimes, codex of law, robbery, theft, forgery and scams, bonds, suing, arrests, interrogation, investigation, miscellaneous, identification, unsanctioned troop use, property damage, imperial palace, flood and arson, livestock, marketplace, band production, and nobility laws. There were a total of 620 subsections and a total of 27,657 characters in this entire codex. And I say just because by comparison, the Han Code of Laws had only 9 chapters, but over 7 million characters. So the Jin Code of Law was by leaps and bounds much more concise and thus more clear. For this reason, the Jin Code of Law would remain in use throughout the southern dynasties even after the end of the Jin dynasty, making it one of the longest continually used legal documents in Chinese history. It was also the first code of law to incorporate the familial structure system of Confucianism to classify different levels of punishment based on how closely related you are to the one convicted of the crime. Now, while the discussion of court reforms can be boring, the last point I want to reinforce here before I end the episode is the degree that Sima Yan had to restructure the court positions in order to reward the Gentry clans that had helped him become emperor. For the entirety of Chinese history up until the Jin dynasty, there were at most 3 Grand Excellency level positions that were often called Sangong that sat atop of the imperial court. They were typically the Grand Excellency of the masses in charge of the affairs of the people, the Grand Excellency of the works in charge of the construction and production, and the Grand Commandant in charge of the military. But Sima Yan had far too many people he had to reward to pick just 3 for these highest honors in the imperial court, so instead he renamed the Minister of Imperial Household to Grand Minister and gave the position to Sima Fu, who was still alive at this point. He promoted Grand Tutor to the same level of prestige as the other grand titles and gave the position to Zheng Chong, a well-respected senior scholar. The Grand Tutor of the Crown Prince was also elevated and given to Wang Xiang, who was the previous Grand Commandant of Wei. Da Sima, or the Supreme Military Commander, was also elevated and given to General Shi Bao. Grand General was likewise elevated and given to Chen Qian. In the end, Sima Yan created a grand total of 8 Grand Excellency tier positions, and these 8 were collectively called the 8 Grand Founding Members of Jin, or Xi Jin, Kai Guo Ba Gong. And with that, the setup for the Jin Dynasty is complete. As we're going to be ending our episode here, next time when we return, we'll shift our attention back to military matters, as naturally the next step for the Jin dynasty would be an attack on the kingdom of Wu, the last piece of the puzzle to a full reunification of all of China. So hopefully you all have enjoyed this episode enough to consider subscribing to the channel for more content on Three Kingdoms history, or simply support the channel by leaving a comment below, or just by hitting the like button. And as always, I'll see you all next time. Bye!